Well, good morning to you. My name's David Halsey and I lead the staff team here at the Office of Tax Simplification. As people continue to join, it's good to welcome you today to this webinar on our recently published Claims and Elections report, whether this is the first OTS webinar you've attended or if you were also able to join us for our 10th anniversary webinar in September. As we begin, just a few housekeeping points. During the webinar, only the speakers will be visible. You as attendees will be in listen-only mode, but do please ask questions in the Q&A facility online. There's a button at the bottom of the screen, and do ask questions in there and upvote other people's questions that you'd welcome a response to, and we'll pick up as many of those as we can. We're recording the webinar and hope to make some or all of it available later. So our agenda for this morning is here. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the OTS and then hand over in turn to Bill Dodwell, our tax director, and to Beth and Kay, who led the work on this review, to take you through it. And then we'll come to a range of your questions. So this is our OTS on a slide, our one-slide introduction to who we are. The OTS's role, as many of you will know, is to give independent advice to the government on simplifying the UK tax system to make things easier for taxpayers. We bring a mix of public and private sector expertise together in the team and work to an independent board chaired by Catherine Kieran's OBE. It's important to note, as we always say, that we advise, we do not decide or implement decisions. Changes to the tax system remain a matter for the government. But it's good to see, particularly with this Claims and Elections report, that it's attracted high-level support from HMRC Director General Ruth Stanier, as you may have seen from our website. With that, I'm now going to hand over to Bill Dodwell, who's going to begin to take you through this review. Bill.
Thanks very much, David. Called Own Initiative Review, which means it wasn't directly requested by the Chancellor, but it is something where we have worked closely with Treasury and the Revenue, as well as very much, of course, with the large number of people who made representations and comments and gave us evidence, which was really, really helpful in coming up with our recommendations here. And it is very pleasing that Ruth Stanier has, welcomed the review, and we really hope that quite a few of the recommendations will be taken forward by a mixture of the government and by HMRC. Some things obviously require that we change the law. Other ones will be changes in processes and procedures generally. So let me just move to the first slide and cover, what I think is one of the sort of biggest overarching recommendations. This just sets out our process. We started in February, as you can see, where we endeavored to look at, the number of reliefs and exemptions and how many claims. I had the really naive hope that we'd be able to count the number of different claims you could make under the legislation. It's just too hard. But it's worth noting, of course, that the National Audit Office now believes we have 1,190 reliefs built into the UK tax system. And a few of those, obviously the personal allowance, don't require a claim at all. But the vast majority of claims, and obviously all elections, require taxpayer intervention in order to deliver the result requested. So, it's an important in that sort of sense more generally. Now, the next slide talks about one of the big opportunities, I think, going forward. These are the three biggest recommendations. There are 15 in total in the report. And I'm going to cover really essentially the first one, and Bethan is going to cover all the other ones, which you know is very helpful. We've got quite a few specific ones too. We're not going to spend masses of time on those, but happy to take questions about how those might work as well. So let me start with number one, which is on the next slide, and this is the increased functionality of the personal tax account and the business tax account. We, the Office of Tax Simplification, very much see the personal tax account as the way for all taxpayers, or individual taxpayers for sure, including those in business, to interact with HMRC. This should be the sort of single hub where everybody can deposit information, calculations are done, claims should be made through it and stored in the personal tax account, all that sort of thing. And with all of that, we would actually deliver a really good experience, we would suggest, to all taxpayers. Cost savings for HMRC and for taxpayers as well. Agent access is really, really important. Of course, that doesn't currently exist, but it would need to exist in the future. And you know, the great thing, of course, is to move to that so-called single digital account, which is sort of covered in HMRC's 10-year strategy. But at the moment, the personal tax account isn't bad. Sadly, work on developing it stopped in April 2018, as HMRC had to divert resources into dealing with systems for Brexit, in particular customs systems, of course. But you know, if you've been on your personal tax account, as I think all of us on the webcast from the OTS have done, you can indeed see your state pension entitlement, which is, you know, good for some of us getting a bit closer to that than others. You can look at your tax code, you can look at last year's information, all that sort of good stuff, and you can tell HMRC about a change of address. The problem is that if you're in business, or if you're a landlord, you have a separate business tax account, and the login details are the same, as you may know, but they're not really connected. They sort of look a bit connected, but actually they're not. They're two different systems, and in particular, information does not flow between them. So if you're a self-employed person and an employee, which covers, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, in the UK today, you find that your income from those sources is very much compartmentalized, and coming up with that rounded tax picture, which obviously is the only relevant one, just isn't possible through these accounts. So the next slide sort of talks about that vision from HMRC, launched by the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Jessie Norman, where, as you can see on the next slide when it pops up, taxpayers should be able to view their tax position and tell HMRC anything it needs to know through a single online account. And that sounds easy to say. Delivering that isn't so simple for HMRC, because the two things are on a different system. So pulling the functionality from the sort of older, less up-to-date business tax account and plonking it into the more modern personal accounts development and adding to it, as we suggest in this report, is clearly going to take some money, some resources of people, and some time to be able to deliver all of that. But it's brilliant to see that this is very much a goal for HMRC going forward. So our next slide sort of shows the sort of key recommendations in this area. So the first thing is they should be merged. We get all of that, but they've got to be the hub for all taxpayer engagement. You may have noticed, and Bethan will talk about employees making claims for expenses. there are some online facilities to do that, but you can't start in the personal tax account, and that's obviously a mistake because it doesn't help taxpayers focus on the one thing that is really useful for them, their personal tax account. And given that, you know, so many of us are online today, and so many of the businesses or you know, other agencies we engage with offer an account, everything from a bank account to a mobile phone online account, all that sort of thing. People are very used to doing that and used to the functionality it provides, and having the tax account there is going to be really helpful as well, we would suggest. So we'd very much like to see the personal tax account and the new single digital account become the place where you make a standalone claim or election. And that should include uploading supporting documentation where appropriate. Now that's going to require that HMRC builds a facility to store documents. And when you know think that there are about 47 million liable to income tax, we have a sort of issue there about scale, but it's really important that we can hold all this stuff centrally. The HMRC officers have access to it, the system has access to it naturally for the purpose of calculations and automation, and that taxpayers and agents should be able to pick all of that up as well more generally. So as well as all of that, we think that our next slide just picks up a couple of other points. One of the big issues with claims is should they need, we flipped too far. One of the big things with claims is many of them require a signature, a so-called wet signature with a bit of ink and all that sort of stuff. Now, HMRC have made various easements for COVID, which is very helpful, naturally. But we think that if you make the claims via your digital account with HMRC, you've provided authentication. Because obviously you've had to log into the account and use all the security of that to demonstrate that it's you rather than somebody else. So that ought to deal with that particular issue. Now, you may need to change the law to provide that sort of thing. This is one of the many digital questions that I think the tax administration strategy includes. But it would just be a simpler and better way all round more generally. And finally, that vital point about agent access. Not everyone has a tax agent, of course, but very large numbers of taxpayers in business, self-employed people, do have a tax agent, and it's absolutely essential that agent access can be provided. Again, that requires quite a lot of systems work in order to deliver all of that, but it is fundamental to how everything really needs to operate in a manner that say that should overall produce cost savings for HMRC and cost savings, real tangible benefits for taxpayers at large. So that's why we sort of led with our focus on that particular area. So that's the end of what I'm going to cover. It's now time for me to hand over to Bethan Kay, who, as David said, led this project, and she's going to cover the rest of it.
Thanks, Bill. So as Bill mentioned previously, there were 15 recommendations made in this report covering a number of different areas. Some of them general areas that covered like sort of across the tax system, making claims and elections in general. And then we also focused on some specific claims and elections as well. So if we move on to the next slide, the first area that I'm going to talk about is around employee expenses. There we go. So employee expenses is probably one of the bigger claims that we looked at. We know that over 5 million employees made 7.5 million claims in the 2017-18 tax year. And claims for relief can be on certain types of expenses that aren't reimbursed by employers. So that's, for example, cleaning uniforms, maintaining tools, sort of claims for sort of mileage, professional fees and subscriptions. And obviously at the moment, what is quite has come to the fore a bit more is making a claim for relief for extra expenses incurred for working from home, and I know a number of people are making claims for that at the moment. So there's quite a few different ways that you can make a claim for tax relief for employee expenses. So that it sort of depends what claim you are making, what area of employee expenses you're making a claim for. Also, it's different depending on the value of the claim. So if the value of the claim is over £2,500, you have to make the claim on an SA return. Some of the claims for tax relief you can make through a fully digital online system. So that's claims, for example, for professional subscriptions, flat rate expenses, and recently added is the claim for working from home allowance as well. Another way of making a claim is through an online form. It's called a P87, and that has to be completed on a computer, but then printed and then sent through the post to HMRC. And you can also make some claims through writing or on the phone to HMRC. So there's a few different routes, and it sort of depends what the claim is that you're making as to the route that you have to take to do it. This is also an area where high volume agents do operate as well. So this is something that we ask specifically about, whether there's benefits, whether there's drawbacks for using high volume agents. They obviously charge. The charge can be anywhere between around 20% of the value of the relief, or up to around 40-50% of the value of the relief, depending on the sort of agent used. Obviously, this means that the full value of the relief isn't going directly to the taxpayer, which some may see as an issue, but they also do good work in sort of telling people that they can make a claim, and this is something that's available to people, and also helping out with people who perhaps have additional needs or don't speak English as a first language. So there's a bit of a debate around the use of high volume agents in this area. So if we can move on to the next slide. Some of the issues that came up around making claims for employee expenses were firstly around the use of the digital system, and that it should be expanded more widely to cover more types of claim, that we should be able to do this digitally, that having to fill in a form online, print it and post it is quite outdated. And also the point that Bill made earlier about it being integrated within the personal tax account, rather than being sort of a separate online digital system. So the first part of our recommendation in general about all employee expenses is that we should expand digital claims to more types of employee expense and include it within the personal tax account. There was also some concern that the guidance and the forms were not as simple as they could be, especially in relation to some of the materials that high volume agents use, for example, that make it very easy. Everything can be included on one form to them, whereas for HMRC, you have to use a different form for each year and for each different employment that you're making a claim for an expense for. So to be able to make several claims in one go and not have to manually repeat all your personal information on each form, that would be a great improvement, I think, on the forms if it's too difficult or there isn't the funding there to expand the digital system. Another concern that was raised was around how the relief is actually given to employees. So depending on when the claim is for, so if it's for past tax years, for example, often it's given as a refund. But if it's for future years or the current tax year, it's your PAYE code is amended. And this is rolled forward into future years automatically. Now that can cause some difficulties, especially if there's a change in employment, so you're not actually entitled to the relief anymore, or your role changes, so you're not entitled to the relief anymore. At the moment, there's no sort of review point, and you have to be, you're responsible for informing HMRC that your circumstances have changed and you're no longer entitled to this relief. So what we've suggested is that there should be a cut-off or review point, especially where an employee changes employment. Once HMRC is aware of that, they should stop the relief. and a new claim should be made for a new employment if they're entitled to the relief still. It also causes difficulties, for example, if the level of relief changes over years. For example, for professional subscriptions, it might increase year on year. So there could be review points just to make sure that it's both relevant and up to the amount of relief given is up to date entirely. So that was our sort of general overarching recommendations for all employee expenses. If we can move on to the next slide, flat rate expenses. So they're a certain type of employee expense that are designed to cover sort of small amounts of non-reimbursed costs associated with sort of repairing and maintaining work equipment. So, for example, associated with cleaning of uniforms, repairing tools. We know that in 2017-18, around 73% of all employees who made claims for employee expenses made flat rate expense claims. So in order to make a claim for flat rate expense, there's sort of a list and that covers different industries and occupations, and these industries and occupations have agreed flat rates with HMRC, and they can range anywhere between sort of £60 and £1,022 a year. However, if your industry or occupation isn't on that list, you can also claim £60 a year anyway if you meet all of the other eligibility criteria. So that's not a huge amount of relief. If your allowance is £60 a year, for example, at a basic rate, that equates to £12 a year of relief, which is £1 a month. Whereas at the higher end, which is £1,022, at basic rate, that's around £200 a year, or about £17 a month. So they're not massive, but they're meant to cover the costs incurred for sort of repairs and cleaning of uniforms. So if we can move to the next slide. This is a chart that shows the average value of flat rate claims per employee in top 10 industries. So I think this shows very quickly, just to show that the two main industries that make claims for employee expenses are healthcare and wholesale and retail trade. So they're quite significant compared to the others, around 850,000 and 750,000 employees in those industries making claims in the 2017-18 tax year. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So some of the key issues that were raised around flat rate expenses mainly covered the list of expenses. So the fact that there were so many different industries, so many different occupations, there's around 85 different occupations covering 35 industries that an employee would have to look through to try and identify whether the job that they do fit within, and therefore they're eligible to claim a certain amount. Obviously, there is the backup. If they think they're still eligible, they could claim £60 a year. But people did find it quite confusing. The list is quite outdated. There's quite a large number of different expenses. So we've suggested that the government should consider streamlining the different levels, so that there's fewer for people to have to consider. So obviously the easiest way of doing that, or what you would consider to be the simplest, would just be have one level, for example, of flat rate expenses. And we know that if we wanted that to be sort of revenue neutral, so not costing the exchequer anything, that would have to be at a level of around £93 a year, which obviously would disadvantage some people, as the majority of flat rate expense allowances range between around £60 and £120 a year at the moment. So we've suggested in the report that perhaps you could have a lower and a higher level, perhaps around £80 and £120, but obviously more work would have to be done to look at sort of the different levels and how that could be done. Another suggestion that we've made is to look again about whether the relief for flat rate expenses could be incorporated with an employer's payroll process. So this would automate the relief for employees, meaning that the however many million of employees that are entitled to the relief wouldn't have to individually make a claim. Obviously, this would be an added burden to employers, but we think if it could be done in a really simple way, so for example, a tick box on the RTI process, perhaps this could be a much simpler way of doing it, and it also could cut out the role of high volume repayment agents, who so meaning that all of the relief would end up with the employee rather than some in the hands of agents. Okay, so I think that covers flat rate expenses. So if we could move on to the next slide, the third key area that we've touched on within the report is around HMRC's online forms. So I think this is one of the areas that came up most during our discussions and during the work on this process as being sort of a key area of frustration. So people really don't like the majority of HMRC's online forms. There was a lot of suggestions in this area. There's a lot of different types of forms that are used by HMRC for making claims in elections. So, I mean, we've touched on sort of the fully online digital processes, the fact that some forms you have to complete on a computer, print and post. You can request forms directly from HMRC, and they will send you sort of a physical form to complete. So there is a variety of different ones, but I mean, some of the key frustrations that came out, I think, were the fact that a lot of the forms don't tell you right at the beginning all of the information that's required in order for you to fully complete the form. And then also, in addition to that, you can't sort of save and go back to the form if you haven't got all the information that is required. Also, a suggestion of adding a free text box and being able to upload a document to support whatever claim in election you were making, that would help to cut down on sort of further communication with HMRC, which obviously would benefit both sides. Bill previously touched on the fact that if you put more claims and elections within personal and business tax accounts, you could remove the need for wet signatures, which would be great. Also, another issue that came to light was around overseas resident taxpayers and not being able to file online self-assessment returns or make claims online. So we suggest that should be changed within the report. We think that would cut down on a lot of people having to sort of post forms or have to pay for expensive software or the use of an agent in order to submit their returns. So shall we move quickly on to the next slide, which just covers some of the other general recommendations that we've made in the report around time limits and also around guidance. So making sure that guidance on how to make claims in elections is clear, and making more use of test panels to make sure that people who aren't sort of clued up on tax understand guidance, understand the forms that they have to complete, and also just increasing the number of templates that are available so that people don't have to sort of scrabble around looking for what exact information is required on a letter that they send to HMRC. Around time limits, we suggest that claims and elections, it's much easier for people if they refer to tax year or accounting period ends. It's less, people are less likely to miss, not just people, but HMRC and agents, they're less likely to miss deadlines and time limits if it's linked to a tax year or accounting period end. So should we just move on? This is the final slide, which covers some of the other specific recommendations made in the report. So we touch on areas, different specific claims and elections that were raised during the course of the review. So We've made recommendations on the gift aid election to carry back relief, capital allowances, Section 198 elections, corporation tax loss restrictions, Section 455, so loans to participators and reclaiming the tax paid on this, and also on Section 431 and employment-related securities elections. So I think that comes to the end of our slides. So if we want to, we'll move on to taking some questions.
No, that's great. So the first question, which I see comes from an OTS alumnus. So thank you very much for that. Any update on whether linking the capital gains tax on property account to the personal tax account? Sadly, no. I wish I could say this is going to be delivered in, the next month or even 6 months or something like that. But no, I'm afraid we don't have an update of when that's going to happen. But we completely agree that it's exactly what should happen. Everything needs to be run through that personal tax account, the new single digital account, into which you'll migrate. It'll be interesting to see whether HMRC get the necessary money for this in the spending review. The Chancellor, I think, has just announced that he's going to do a 1-year spending review, but clearly HMRC's technology program is a multi-year program. So be interesting to see how that really is going to be funded and dealt with through the system, because without money and without the people to get involved in doing it, we're not going to see these improvements. And overall, we think that these are going to be cost savers for the Exchequer as well as beneficial things all round. But there we are. Another question, any news on whether the business tax account is going to be linked into the personal tax account? Again, sadly, nothing extra to offer on that. We think that will be several years, though. The problem is that those self-assessment details online are really part of an older system, and getting them into the new one is just going to be harder to do more generally. I think that was a couple of things I was going to answer. What got anything you want to pick up, David? Obviously, David's gone. There's one.
Hi, just coming back in.
All right, sorry about that.
That's right. I think I'm just looking at Angela Williams' question about agents being permitted to submit all forms on behalf of clients. That sounds entirely reasonable. Bill, do you have perspectives on that?
Well, I think the first thing that obviously there's got to be some sort of, as there is with sending in a self-assessment tax return, for example, there's got to be a sort of clear way in which the taxpayer has confirmed to the agent that they want the agent to send in the return, make the claim as appropriate. So there's got to be a mechanism to cover all of that, because all these are claims by taxpayers, not claims by people on behalf of taxpayers. So we've got to deal with that. But subject only to that, I can't see any issues around allowing agents to do it. For me, it would be a fairly reasonable thing to offer. Just at the moment, though, there are all sorts of issues with authorizing agents to do this, and those have got to be picked up and dealt with. There are issues, as agents will know, in getting digital authorization as opposed to the old written 64-8. It's one of the forms of yore, isn't it, that even if you've been around in tax for sort of 5 years or 15 years or 25 years, it's still the same sort of fascinating form. But moving to the digital version isn't as simple, because obviously it requires digital authorization by the taxpayer, and that requires government gateway accounts, and people have actually got to be able to do it, and that sort of stuff. I personally think that you know, taxpayers are just going to get with the program. If they use online bank accounts, then they can surely use online tax accounts too. And if, you know, let's agree, obviously, that the reason they're appointing an agent is because they want to offload the work to the agent, which makes lots of sense. But, you know, nonetheless, they need to find a means of authorizing it. I agree it's harder if you're an overseas resident person, all that sort of stuff. HMRC do need to look more at introducing better sort of digital authorization approaches to cover all of that. But yes, agree with all of it. I think there's a question from John Andrews that you probably pick up, Bethan.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I was just looking at this one. So yes, I agree that that high volume agents do seem to do better because they have a good means of communication, advertisement. They work with like unions and large employers, for example, to target their services to employees. And that's something that HMRC just can't match. I know that through our discussions with HMRC on this matter, they're really keen to be able to do more in this space and be able to work with large employers and unions to advertise that these claims are available and that they can all be made directly with HMRC. But obviously, it's like a funding issue and prioritization of funding within HMRC. And we definitely touch on the fact in the review that you know, the lack of advertisement, or rather the use of advertisement by high volume agents, is one of the reasons why we think they're sort of used so often. And we do also sort of make recommendations on increasing sort of, well, making it clearer in the guidance and things that these claims can be made and how they're made, and, you know, the level of relief that's available to people. I think our recommendation on including the claim form within the personal tax account, and then if we can increase visibility of the personal tax account, then, you know, that's one way of getting higher visibility for these sorts of reliefs as well.
I mean, obviously, it's really good that HMRC launched the online facility last year and just added the working from home expenses into that, I think last month, if I get it right. So that obviously is really helpful. But the sad thing is, as Bethan says, it wasn't put in the personal tax account where it should have been in order to drive that sort of usefulness of the account and that hub approach, and the fact that, you know, getting into the psyche of everybody, this is where I go to deal with my tax, which is such an important thing.
Well, just to say, I think we've answered all the questions we've had in the Q&A. If there are other questions or observations that anyone would like to put in there for us to pick up on in the remaining 5 minutes that we've allocated for this webinar, that would be fine. If not, we'll, you know, perhaps in a moment or two be able to give you a minute or two back for a cup of coffee.
Well, just while people are thinking about that, let me just expand on a couple of those specific recommendations that Bethan mentioned at the end. The first one is employment-related securities. At the moment, you have to file an election, or you have to make an election, you don't file it. If you want to be taxed up front on the value you're receiving through an employment-related securities election. We had lots of evidence from a wide range of practitioners in this area that said everyone makes the election. And so the recommendation is simple. It's to reverse it, to say that you should elect out of being taxed up front. And that way you'd reduce the number of elections needed in the first place. You'd still preserve the right to an election, of course, which is really important, but you'd reduce the number of it. And the other thing I think we said is it's essential that the election is actually sent to HMRC. The current election isn't, and that isn't a very good approach to compliance generally, let's just say, as delicately as we reasonably can, because it currently gives rise to sort of practical issues generally. The other one I just was going to mention was the gift aid election. Carryback relief was introduced really to help people who'd made a big one-off gain or got a one-off, amount of income or something like that, and they wanted to give a significant sum to charity, but their income in the following year wasn't big enough to absorb the size of that gain. Size of that gift, I mean. So they needed a carryback, and that was why it was introduced. But we heard from a number of people, including taxpayer, who wrote in specifically on this, saying it was really confusing, and could we get rid of it? So what we've looked at it, no, we shouldn't be getting rid of it, but we think that by imposing a limit above which it would apply and below which it would not apply, you would get rid of this sort of admin concerns that many people have. Have I made a carryback or not? Am I double claiming relief? That sort of question. You deal with that whilst preserving the important policy point of allowing people to make those sort of one-off gifts of money. And at the same time, we don't think they should be just limited to gifts made before you send in your tax return. That's a particularly unhelpful thing. It should just be gifts made in the particular year, and you should be able to amend your return like normal, and you should be able to carry back part of your total gifts in the year. Some people will be aware there's a couple of tribunal cases on that, and it seems crazy that people aren't getting the relief that clearly the policy intent was that they should, and so we recommend picking up a couple of those too. That, I think, brings me to the end of what I was going to say. So thanks very much, David.
You've got one very, very quick question that's just snuck in the door.
Oh,
Are you
genius.
able to pick that up? That's from Rachel.
In practice, gift aids carryback can be used of small amounts. For example, somebody breaching a net income threshold and that sort of thing. I sort of agree, but again, I think we found too much evidence of problems in the area. So we're not suggesting a very high minimum threshold, but we are suggesting that you should know what you're doing when you're making a gift aid payment of a significant amount. So we thought that was a better issue all around. But I agree that there is a challenge with perceived high marginal rates of tax in where you're in the 100 to 129,000 level, for example, and you're having your personal allowance clawed back. There's also possibly a less likely one, but also relevant, where you've got the high income child benefit charge too. So, I wouldn't disagree they're relevant. But when we looked at the amounts of the claims and the average claims and all that sort of thing, we felt that was the overall the better answer. And as I say, it responded to a number of people pointing out challenges of effectively double claiming and not knowing what was going on with quite small amounts. But thanks for that.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. And I think effectively you probably covered Andrew's at the same time.
Yeah.
So look, we're magically arrived at the advertised ending point for this webinar. Just like to say thank you very much everyone for joining. It's been great to have you with us throughout the time. I hope you found that useful. Please do kind of get in touch with us at our usual inbox message if you have any further thoughts or observations to make. We greatly value your support and engagement. Thank you very much indeed. Cheerio.
Bye.